For 50 years, Hollywood kept betting big. Oscar bait, action stars, prestige epics. And almost every year, the movie that made the most money was the one they didn't believe in. Studios tried to kill half these movies before they opened. But they made more money than everything else that year, and sometimes saved the studio doing it. This is 50 years of Hollywood getting lucky, panicking, and cashing the check anyway. The year's 1970, and Hollywood's in turmoil. The old studio system's dying, nobody knows what's going to work anymore. And out of nowhere comes Love Story, a movie that on paper should have been a quiet little romance, and instead turns into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. It cost under $3 million to make and ended up making over $106 million in the US alone. And if you adjust for inflation, that's over $800 million today. That's Avengers-level money for a weepy romance. It outgrossed Patton, which won Best Picture. It doubled up on every other big release that year. It even saved Paramount, which was circling the drain financially. Honestly, Love Story might be the most unexpected box office monster of the decade. 1971 was stacked. You had Dirty Harry, A Clockwork Orange, The French Connection, and yet the biggest movie of the year was a 3-hour-long musical about a Jewish milkman in pre-revolutionary Russia. It grossed over $80 million in the US. And the way they did it was smart. They used a roadshow-style release, limited theaters, premium pricing, and older audiences came out in huge numbers. It was the most successful musical since The Sound of Music, and proved there was still gas in the tank for that sort of movie. Hollywood kept trying to chase that magic, until a bunch of flops later in the decade finally killed off the big-budget musical for good. No one expected The Godfather to blow up the way it did. Brando was considered uninsurable, Coppola was nearly fired, and nobody knew who Al Pacino was. But then it hit theaters, and everything changed. It became the first movie ever to cross $100 million domestically on its initial release. That was unheard of. Lines wrapped around the block for weeks. Paramount had to rush prints out to more theaters because demand was so insane. Before this, studios thought adult dramas were risky. After The Godfather, they realized they could be blockbusters. Despite being released just days before the year ended, The Exorcist still took the top spot for 1973. People fainted, vomited, and lined up around the block in freezing weather to see it. Some theaters even handed out barf bags as a publicity stunt, but the numbers were no joke. It became the highest-grossing film of all time in the US up to that point, dethroning The Godfather in less than a year. And it did it as an R-rated horror film, something no one in Hollywood thought could make blockbuster money. What makes it even wilder is that this was the first horror film ever nominated for Best Picture. The year is 1974, and worldwide the big hit was The Towering Inferno. But domestically, the biggest box office hit was Mel Brooks's fart joke-filled, fourth-wall-breaking, totally insane Western parody. It was so nuts that Warner Brothers actually pulled it from theaters early, not because it was tanking, but because they needed to make room for Young Frankenstein, which was also directed by Mel Brooks. That means in 1974, the same guy had 2 top 10 box office hits playing at the same time. That had literally never happened before. When Jaws hit theaters in June 1975, it opened wider than any movie before it, over 400 screens at once, and launched with a national TV ad blitz. That strategy was almost unheard of back then. It quickly became the highest-grossing film in history. Theaters started keeping it on longer than scheduled just to meet demand, and Universal had to send out replacement reels because the originals were worn out from overuse. It was also the first time studios realized summer could be a prime release window for a blockbuster. Before that, big movies usually opened in December or around Oscar season. That's why people now say that Jaws invented a summer blockbuster. Rocky opened quietly in late November 1976, made on a budget of less than $1 million and starring a complete unknown in the lead. The studio didn't even want Stallone to star, and producers had to fight to keep him in the lead. But within weeks, Rocky was the #1 movie in the country. Unlike Jaws or The Exorcist, this wasn't a studio-backed event film. It spread through word of mouth, with audiences lining up again and again to see it. It played in theaters for nearly 10 months and became the rare film to be both the #1 box office hit and the Best Picture winner in the same year. You'd think this thing was a guaranteed hit from day one, but no. When it opened in May 1977, it was only playing in just 43 theaters. Fox actually had to force some theaters to show it. They bundled it with another movie called The Other Side of Midnight, and if you wanted to play that one, you had to play Star Wars too. And then it blew up. Within 2 weeks, demand went nuts. Fox was shipping out extra prints nonstop, and theaters started running it 24/7. Some cinemas didn't stop playing it for over a year. And here's the wild part. Fox gave George Lucas the merchandising rights because they thought that stuff was worthless. By 1978, the toys alone were making more money than most of Fox's entire movie catalog. Grease nearly fell apart before it started filming. Olivia Newton-John didn't want the part. She'd just bombed in a movie and didn't trust herself on screen. The studio didn't want her either, but Travolta insisted. Director Randall Kleiser had never made a feature, and producer Alan Carr kept overriding him. At one point, their fights got so bad, Kleiser briefly quit. After all this mess, it's kinda not that surprising that the original cut bombed in test screenings. But by the time summer ended, Grease had outgrossed everything except Star Wars. Superman was filmed back-to-back with its sequel, but halfway through production, director Richard Donner was clashing so badly with the producers that they fired him before the second film was finished. The film's December 1978 release missed the peak holiday box office window, but it held strong into 1979 and became the year's top-grossing film. It was the first time a superhero movie was marketed as a prestige event. Warner Brothers brought in John Williams for the score, staged a major Oscar push, and spent more on publicity than any film that year. By spring, it had out-earned Apocalypse Now, Alien, and Kramer vs. Kramer. George Lucas didn't direct The Empire Strikes Back. He handed it to Irvin Kershner, a former professor of his, to avoid burnout, but the shoot spiraled out of control. Harsh weather caused major delays, the budget doubled, and Lucas, who was self-financing the entire thing through a bank loan, had to mortgage everything to keep it going. Fox execs were nervous. Empire was darker, slower, and had no real ending. But the reveal of Darth Vader's identity, kept secret from nearly everyone in the cast, turned it into a cultural flashpoint. Within weeks, it became the biggest film of the year. Superman 2 was already halfway shot when they fired Donner. They brought in Richard Lester to finish the movie and reshoot huge chunks of it so he'd qualify for sole directing credit. Nearly 40% of Donner's footage was tossed, including scenes with Marlon Brando, who sued the producers over unpaid royalties. Christopher Reeve nearly walked off the project over the change in tone, and Gene Hackman refused to return for reshoots. Despite all of that, the film opened to massive numbers. It held the #1 spot for 6 weeks and became the highest-grossing film of 1981, even beat Raiders of the Lost Ark. Universal kept E.T. under wraps so tightly that Spielberg didn't allow any trailers with finished footage. They only screened it once before release, for the Cannes Film Festival, and the response was overwhelming. Theaters extended showings, and some ran it for over a year without pulling it. By early 1983, E.T. passed Star Wars as the highest-grossing film in history. It never dropped out of the weekly top 10 for 6 straight months. Columbia Pictures had passed on the project years earlier, calling it a wimpy Disney movie. By the time it crossed $300 million, execs at Columbia were reportedly forbidden from mentioning it aloud. Return of the Jedi was nearly directed by David Lynch. Lucas offered it to him personally, but Lynch turned it down, saying the material gave him a headache. Lucas then approached David Cronenberg, who also passed. Richard Marquand finally took the job, but Lucas remained heavily involved, often directing scenes himself without credit. The film opened on a Wednesday to over 1,000 screens, the widest release ever at the time. Within 3 weeks, it had outgrossed everything in theaters, including Flashdance and War Games. Ghostbusters was originally written with John Belushi, Eddie Murphy, and Dan Aykroyd in mind. Belushi died before the script was finished, and Murphy turned down the film to make Beverly Hills Cop. When Reitman signed on, he told the studio they'd need $30 million in 6 months for post-production. Columbia gave them half the time. They rushed to meet the summer release date, finishing some scenes just days before it hit theaters. Ghostbusters debuted the same weekend as Gremlins, and both films broke box office records. It held the #1 spot for 7 weeks straight and became the second highest grossing comedy of all time, behind Tootsie. Back to the Future was shot once and then reshot. Michael J. Fox was always the first choice for Marty McFly, but he was unavailable, so they filmed 5 weeks with Eric Stoltz instead. When producers realized Stoltz wasn't working, they scrapped nearly everything and started over. Universal executives hated the title and pushed Spielberg to change it to Spaceman from Pluto. He ignored the memo and never responded. The film opened in July with almost no fanfare, but within days, theaters were sold out. It became the biggest hit of 1985 and stayed in the top 10 for over 3 months straight. Top Gun had the backing of the Pentagon, which gave the filmmakers access to aircraft carriers and fighter jets, but insisted on final script approval. Entire plot lines were adjusted to keep Navy recruitment interests intact. The producers then leaned into that cooperation, building a marketing campaign around military glamour and selling it like a rock concert. Navy recruitment offices reportedly set up booths outside theaters, and enlistment spiked so sharply after release that even Congress took notice. Beverly Hills Cop 2 was greenlit after Paramount forced Eddie Murphy to choose between it and The Golden Child. After the success of Top Gun, Paramount brought in Tony Scott to direct it. They wanted the same slick visual style, even if Scott had never directed a comedy. The studio gave Eddie Murphy a then-record $12 million paycheck, but he was unhappy with the script and didn't care for press. He skipped interviews, skipped the premiere, and later said he only showed up for the money. Still, the film beat Fatal Attraction, The Untouchables, and Lethal Weapon to become the highest-grossing movie of the year. Disney almost shut down Who Framed Roger Rabbit multiple times during production. The budget ballooned past $50 million, and the animation pipeline couldn't keep up. Spielberg had to personally negotiate with Warner Bros. And other studios just to allow Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and other characters to appear alongside Disney's. It opened with no guarantee audiences would buy into the hybrid format, but it quickly became a box office hit and was the first non-Disney animated film to dominate summer theaters. Warner Bros. Faced massive backlash for casting Michael Keaton. Over 50,000 protest letters were sent before the trailer even dropped. Fans wanted an action star, not the lead from Mr. Mom. Burton was told to shoot 2 endings in case Keaton's version bombed with test audiences. But the teaser trailer was so successful that people bought tickets to other movies just to see it. Despite all the mess behind the scenes, Batman broke opening weekend records and passed Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade to become the year's biggest hit. Paramount didn't actually want Patrick Swayze for this. Executives thought he was wrong for the part and pushed for Kevin Kline, Alec Baldwin, even Bruce Willis, who turned it down and later called it the biggest mistake of his career. The studio also fought the casting of Whoopi Goldberg, until Swayze insisted she be given the role. She won an Oscar for it. The film opened in July with modest expectations, but stayed in theaters for over 6 months. It outperformed Pretty Woman, Home Alone, and Dances with Wolves to become the highest-grossing film of the year. Terminator 2 was the most expensive film ever made at the time, with a budget that ballooned past $100 million. James Cameron used the money to pioneer digital effects. The crew also blew up a full-scale office building interior in one take because it was cheaper than building a model. Arnold Schwarzenegger was paid $15 million, which worked out to about $21,000 per word of dialogue. The film opened on July 3rd with a record-breaking 5-day gross and dethroned Robin Hood, Beauty and the Beast, and The Silence of the Lambs to take the year's top spot. McDonald's pulled their Happy Meal tie-in for Batman Returns after just a few weeks. Parents complained that the film was too violent and sexually charged for kids. Tim Burton had taken full creative control after the first film's success and pushed the sequel into darker territory. Studio execs were caught off guard when early audiences reacted badly to the tone. Despite a massive opening, the film dropped off fast. Warner Brothers considered it a disappointment and moved to replace Burton for the next entry. Still, it beat Home Alone 2, Lethal Weapon 3, and A Few Good Men at the domestic box office that year. Steven Spielberg was in post-production on Jurassic Park while shooting Schindler's List in Poland. He'd spend his days filming the Holocaust drama and his nights approving dinosaur CGI over satellite link. The digital effects replaced stop-motion late in production, after Spielberg saw a short test and ordered an immediate overhaul. The film broke opening weekend records, surpassed E.T. in just 4 months, and became the highest-grossing movie ever made at the time. Universal planned the marketing like a military campaign. Over 100 licensees were signed before the movie even premiered. The Lion King was considered a B project at Disney. Most of the studio's top animators had chosen to work on Pocahontas instead, believing it had more prestige potential. Elton John initially turned down the job of writing music, then changed his mind, submitted a demo of Circle of Life, and got the job after a single meeting. During production, the 1994 Northridge earthquake shut down the studio, and animators had to finish major sequences while working remotely, unheard of at the time. Despite doubts internally, the film broke every record for hand-drawn animation and remained Disney's biggest hit until Finding Nemo a decade later. After the backlash to Batman Returns, Warner Brothers forced out Tim Burton and brought in Joel Schumacher to reboot the tone entirely. Val Kilmer was cast after Michael Keaton walked off over script issues, and test screenings were brutal. Audiences thought the original cut was too dark, so the studio chopped nearly 40 minutes, including a full subplot about Bruce Wayne's trauma. Despite production fights and bad press, the film opened huge and became the top-grossing release of 1995, beating Toy Story, Apollo 13, and Braveheart. 20th Century Fox greenlit Independence Day based on a single image, the White House exploding. The film was shot in under 75 days, and nearly all the effects were done with miniatures and motion control. Fox rushed the July 3rd release to beat Twister and Mission Impossible to summer dominance. Test screenings went so well that they pulled the embargo early and doubled the marketing budget. By the end of its run, the film had outgrossed Forrest Gump, Jurassic Park, and The Lion King to become Fox's highest-grossing film to date. Steven Spielberg produced Men in Black, but Sony didn't want Tommy Lee Jones. They thought he was too serious and pushed for Clint Eastwood. The final script was revised during shooting, with most of the alien designs changed on the fly after test audiences found the original ones too scary. Will Smith, fresh off Independence Day, recorded the theme song in one night and delivered Sony a surprise hit single. The movie opened the same week as Contact and buried it. It ended up as the biggest domestic hit of 1997, narrowly edging out The Lost World. Titanic ran 199 days in U.S. theaters and stayed at number 1 for 15 straight weekends, a record that still stands. But it nearly collapsed in post. The film was 100 days over schedule and $100 million over budget. Fox executives tried to cut scenes, shorten the runtime, and even proposed releasing it in 2 parts. James Cameron told them to fire him or leave him alone. Every studio expected it to flop. Instead, it became the first film to cross $1 billion worldwide and doubled the domestic gross of Saving Private Ryan. The Phantom Menace was the most hyped movie of the decade. Advanced ticket lines formed weeks early. Fans camped outside theaters just to be first. Some moviegoers bought tickets to other films like Meet Joe Black and Wing Commander solely to watch the Phantom Menace trailer and then left. But after release, backlash hit fast. Jar Jar Binks was panned, and critics attacked the dialogue and tone. Still, the film broke every opening weekend record, stayed in theaters for nearly 6 months, and became the second highest grossing movie of all time, behind Titanic. Starring Jim Carrey at the absolute peak of his box office powers, The Grinch was one of the highest-grossing holiday films of all time, holding the domestic Christmas movie record until 2018's The Grinch, the animated one. The film employed over 100 makeup artists and won the Oscar for Best Makeup, though it was shut out in every other major category. And of course, it was also a merchandising juggernaut. Universal and Imagine Entertainment made hundreds of millions from toys, fast food tie-ins, and licensing deals. Every major studio passed on Harry Potter, including Disney, before Warner Brothers bought the rights in 1999. J.K. Rowling had script approval and veto power over casting. She insisted the film use an all-British cast and personally rejected several high-profile American actors offered roles. Steven Spielberg was briefly attached to direct, but dropped out after clashing with the studio. He wanted to combine multiple books into one animated film. The movie opened to record-breaking numbers and went on to outgross The Fellowship of the Ring, Shrek, and Pearl Harbor, all released the same year. Sony bet big on this one. Security was so tight during production that script pages were watermarked and destroyed daily. When it finally opened, Spider-Man became the first film in history to break $100 million in a single weekend. Attack of the Clones opened 1 week later but couldn't catch up. For the first time ever, a Star Wars film was outgrossed in its year of release. Spider-Man stayed at number 1 for 4 weeks and ended 2002 as the biggest box office hit Sony had ever released. Filming on Return of the King had wrapped 2 years before release. Peter Jackson shot the entire trilogy back-to-back in New Zealand, with only 1 day off between films. By the time Return premiered, the editing process had stretched so long, Jackson was still sending effects shots to the studio days before the final print shipped. It became the highest-grossing film of the year and swept all 11 Academy Award categories it was nominated for, tying the all-time record set by Ben-Hur and Titanic. It also had the widest Oscar sweep without a single acting nomination. No other film has matched that combination since. DreamWorks was caught off guard when Shrek 2 tested better than any animated film they'd ever made, including the original. The movie broke opening weekend records and passed Finding Nemo in under a month. It became the highest-grossing animated film in U.S. history at the time and briefly held the record for the fastest film to reach $400 million. For a short stretch in 2004, Shrek 2 was the second highest-grossing film in U.S. box office history, behind only Titanic. Lucasfilm kept security so tight on Revenge of the Sith that the script was watermarked and printed on red paper to prevent photocopying. But a work print still leaked online 6 hours before the world premiere, making it one of the earliest and most high-profile cases of pre-release digital piracy. It was the first Star Wars film to receive a PG-13 rating, and Lucas publicly stated it was the darkest movie he'd ever make. Despite backlash from the first 2 prequels, Revenge of the Sith drew huge crowds and became the top-grossing film of 2005, beating Harry Potter sequel, The Chronicles of Narnia, and Nolan's Batman Begins. The first Pirates film was expected to flop. When it became a runaway hit, Disney ordered 2 sequels to be shot back-to-back, without finished scripts. Dead Man's Chest started filming with major plot points still undecided, and daily rewrites shaped entire action scenes on location. Despite the chaos, it opened to the biggest domestic weekend in history at the time, passing Spider-Man. It outgrossed Cars, The Da Vinci Code, and X-Men: The Last Stand, crossed $1 billion worldwide, and became Disney's highest-grossing film until Toy Story 3 4 years later. Sony forced Sam Raimi to include Venom, a character he didn't want, after producer Avi Arad argued that fans demanded it. The script ballooned, and so did the budget. Final costs neared $260 million, the most expensive film ever made at the time. Luckily, the film still broke opening weekend records but divided audiences immediately. Raimi later said he had no emotional connection to the material and regretted how studio interference shaped the final cut. Still, it outgrossed Shrek the Third, Transformers, and Harry Potter to become the year's biggest hit. Warner Brothers didn't plan to make a sequel this soon. Batman Begins had been a moderate hit in 2005, but not a phenomenon. But when Casino Royale came out in 2006, studio execs pushed Nolan to go bigger with Batman, especially overseas. They gave him a larger budget only after he agreed to shoot key sequences in IMAX, the first time a studio blockbuster attempted it. The Dark Knight took in more in its first weekend than Batman Begins earned in its entire domestic run. It also forced the Academy to expand its Best Picture nominee list the following year, after fan backlash over its omission. Paramount fast-tracked the sequel before the first Transformers even left theaters. When the 2007 writers' strike hit, production didn't stop. They kept shooting with a bare-bones outline, banking on spectacle to carry the gaps. Hasbro's toy schedule was locked before the final script was done, so entire characters were added just to match action figure molds already in manufacturing. The result was critically panned, but the movie still dominated the summer box office, beating Harry Potter, Twilight, Star Trek, Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, and even Avatar in domestic gross. Avatar was delayed for nearly a decade while James Cameron waited for technology to catch up. He wrote the first treatment in 1994 and shelved it until he saw the motion capture advances made during the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Nearly every camera system used on set had to be invented from scratch. Studios doubted the film would land with audiences. It had no stars, no franchise, and wasn't based on a comic or book. Fox executives reportedly called it a $300 million gamble on Blue Aliens. When it opened, it stayed #1 for 7 straight weekends. 2011 was the last time a young adult fantasy ruled the box office. Deathly Hallows Part 2 landed after a full decade of Potter films, and studios were still scrambling to replicate the formula, launching everything from Percy Jackson to the Golden Compass. But none of them made it to the finish line. That same year, Marvel was still in setup mode. The Avengers hadn't landed yet. Harry Potter was the last global franchise to dominate before the superhero template locked into place. After this, every studio shifted to shared universes. Nothing like Harry Potter was greenlit again. Marvel executives weren't sure Joss Whedon could handle the scope. He had directed only one feature film before the Avengers, and production involved 4 separate franchises converging into a single shoot. Early cuts tested poorly until Whedon restructured the entire final act around the Battle of New York. It opened in May and immediately passed The Dark Knight to become the highest-grossing superhero film in U.S. history. Disney added IMAX screens and pulled other films from release just to keep it in theaters longer. It was also the first Marvel film to pass $600 million domestically. Iron Man 3 was the first Marvel release after the Avengers, and expectations were so high that Shane Black was brought in to give the script a fresh angle. The film was a co-production with a Chinese studio, which led to a special cut of the film released only in China, featuring extra scenes and product placements shot separately. It became the second fastest film ever to cross $1 billion worldwide and outgrossed every other Iron Man and Avengers film in the US except the original Avengers. For 3 consecutive years, Marvel movies claimed top spot at the box office. With Guardians, it did look like a gamble at first. It had no recognizable characters, a talking raccoon, and a first-time blockbuster director in James Gunn. Gunn was given creative control, but told to keep the budget under $200 million, forcing him to use a smaller VFX crew than usual. During early press screenings, critics openly predicted it would be Marvel's first real flop, but test screenings reversed everything. The film blew past Captain America: The Winter Soldier and the Lego Movie to become the top domestic hit of the year. Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012 and immediately announced a new trilogy. The Force Awakens was the first Star Wars film in over a decade, and the first without George Lucas involved. He submitted a story treatment that was scrapped almost entirely. J.J. Abrams came on board after multiple directors passed, including Brad Bird and Matthew Vaughn. The film opened to $247 million and passed Avatar within a month to become the highest-grossing domestic release in history. Disney made back nearly half its $4 billion Lucasfilm purchase on that one film alone. Pixar hadn't made a sequel outside Toy Story, and Finding Dory was a gamble, especially coming 13 years after the original. Ellen DeGeneres had pushed for it for years, but the studio didn't move forward until Andrew Stanton changed his mind and rewrote the story to focus entirely on Dory's memory loss. The release came just 3 months after Zootopia and 2 months before Moana. Disney had a really busy year. Despite that, Dory opened to the biggest weekend ever for an animated film at the time. It became the first Pixar sequel to outgross its original in the US, passing Finding Nemo's total after just 13 days in theaters. Rian Johnson was given full creative freedom on The Last Jedi, including the right to write the script without studio notes. His decisions triggered one of the most polarized receptions in Star Wars history. Some fans launched organized campaigns to tank user scores on Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb. Despite the controversy, it became the highest-grossing film of 2017 and the second highest of the entire saga in the US, behind only The Force Awakens. Disney stood by Johnson publicly, but behind the scenes began shelving planned spin-offs. For the better, I guess. Black Panther was never expected to break records. Early tracking projected an opening under $100 million, and Disney scheduled it for February, a slot typically reserved for smaller releases. But demand exploded after early screenings, and it debuted with over $200 million, one of the biggest openings in history at the time. In the US, it held the #1 spot for 5 straight weeks, something no MCU film had done since The Avengers. It outgrossed Incredibles 2 and Jurassic World and even Infinity War domestically. Endgame was shot back-to-back with Infinity War, but the scripts were kept separate and most of the cast didn't know how their arcs would resolve until weeks before filming. The final battle sequence alone involved over 60 actors and took months to schedule due to overlapping contracts. It broke nearly every presale and opening weekend record and became the fastest film ever to cross $1 billion worldwide. In the US, it passed Titanic and Black Panther in less than 2 weeks. It also marked the end of Marvel's Infinity Saga, closing a 22-film storyline that began in 2008. MCU's been just limping along since then. Bad Boys for Life had been in development hell since 2008. Michael Bay didn't return, and the project was nearly scrapped after multiple delays, script rewrites, and budget concerns. Sony finally handed it to 2 Belgian directors who had never made a Hollywood feature. Will Smith reportedly insisted on them after seeing one of their indie films. The movie opened in January, usually a dead zone for releases, and became the highest-grossing US film of 2020 by default when theaters shut down 2 months later. It outgrossed Tenet, Sonic the Hedgehog, and The Invisible Man, all of which had their box office runs interrupted by lockdowns. Sony and Marvel kept the multiverse casting under wraps with fake scripts, misdirected trailers, and NDAs so strict that Andrew Garfield had to lie to his friends. When the first trailer dropped, it broke the global record for most views in 24 hours, beating Avengers Endgame. The movie opened in December with limited international markets and no support from China, yet still became the biggest US release since Endgame. It was the only film of 2021 to cross $1 billion globally, and it did so without a single dollar from streaming or premium on-demand platforms. This wasn't just the highest-grossing film of 2022. It was Tom Cruise's first-ever billion-dollar movie, and it took down every Marvel and DC release that year. Paramount delayed Top Gun Maverick 5 times over 2 years. Tom Cruise refused to let the film debut on streaming and personally blocked multiple offers from Apple and Netflix. The film opened to $126 million domestic But its real power was in legs. It stayed in the US top 5 for over 10 weeks. Maverick ended up outgrossing 3 different big-budget sequels domestically: Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, Doctor Strange 2, and even Avatar: The Way of Water. Barbie had been stuck in development for over a decade, with Amy Schumer and Anne Hathaway both attached at different points. When Greta Gerwig signed on, she was given full creative control, but had to keep the script hidden even from Mattel. The studio expected Barbie to do well, but not break records. It opened against Oppenheimer in a release duel dubbed Barbenheimer, and both films overperformed. Barbie became the highest-grossing film ever directed by a woman, and Warner Brothers' biggest domestic release in its 100-year history, beating even Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. The surprise isn't that Inside Out 2 did well, it's that it became the highest-grossing animated movie of all time, sailing past Frozen 2 and the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Pixar had been struggling at the box office after Lightyear and Elemental underperformed. Disney moved Inside Out 2 back to a full theatrical release and doubled down on marketing, reuniting most of the original voice cast and adding Maya Hawke as Anxiety. It opened in June and immediately broke the record for the biggest US opening weekend of any animated film, passing The Incredibles 2.